along the banks of the Nile River in the northeastern corner of Africa. One of humanity's most extraordinary civilizations emerged over 5,000 years ago. Ancient Egypt would endure for 3 millennia, outlasting empires, witnessing the rise and fall of countless nations, and leaving behind monuments that still capture our imagination today. This is the story of a civilization that gave us writing, advanced mathematics, and architectural wonders. A society that worshipped gods with animal heads, preserved their dead for eternity, and built pyramids that aligned with the stars. Welcome to ancient Egypt, a journey through one of history's most fascinating and enduring cultures. To understand Egypt, we must first understand the Nile. The Greek historian Herodotus called Egypt the gift of the Nile, and no description has ever been more accurate. The Nile is the longest river in Africa, stretching over 4,000 miles from its sources in the highlands of East Africa to the Mediterranean Sea. Unlike most rivers, the Nile flows from south to north, and ancient Egyptians referred to the south as Upper Egypt and the north as Lower Egypt, upstream and downstream. Every year, like clockwork, the Nile would flood. Beginning in July, the river would swell with waters and silt from the Ethiopian highlands. By September, the floodwaters would recede, leaving behind a layer of rich black soil, so fertile that the Egyptians called their land Kemet, meaning the Black Land. This annual inundation was the foundation of Egyptian agriculture. The predictability of the flood allowed farmers to plan their planting seasons with precision. They grew wheat, barley, flax for linen, and papyrus, the writing material that would become synonymous with Egyptian civilization. Beyond the narrow strip of cultivated land along the Nile lay the Deshret, the red land-vast deserts that served as natural barriers against invasion. To the west stretched the Sahara Desert. To the east lay mountains and desert leading to the Red Sea. This geographic isolation allowed Egyptian culture to develop largely undisturbed for centuries. The Nile provided more than just water and fertile soil. It was Egypt's highway, enabling travel and trade. Boats sailed north with the current and south with the prevailing winds. The river teemed with fish, and its marshes supported wildlife birds, hippos, and crocodiles that would feature prominently in Egyptian religion and daily life. Human settlement along the Nile dates back to the Stone Age, but the civilization we recognize as ancient Egypt began to take shape around 3500 BCE, during what we call the pre-dynastic period. In these early times, Egypt was not one nation, but many small communities and chiefdoms. Archaeological evidence shows 2 distinct cultures emerging, one in Upper Egypt, centered around Hierakonpolis and Nakada, and another in Lower Egypt, in the Nile Delta region. These early Egyptians were already sophisticated. They created beautiful pottery with distinctive decorations, crafted tools from stone and copper, and began developing religious beliefs that would persist for millennia. They buried their dead with grave goods, suggesting a belief in an afterlife. Around 3100 BCE, a momentous event occurred: the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. According to Egyptian tradition, a king named Narmer, also known as Menes, conquered the north and united the 2 lands under his rule. The famous Narmer palette, discovered in 1898, depicts this king wearing both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, symbolizing his control over both regions. Whether Narmer was a historical figure or a legendary composite of several rulers remains debated, but the unification was real. This event marked the beginning of the early dynastic period and the first dynasty of Egyptian pharaohs. The newly unified Egypt established its capital at Memphis, strategically located at the junction between Upper and Lower Egypt. From this point forward, the pharaoh would always wear the double crown, the pieshen, combining the white and red crowns as a symbol of unified Egypt. This unification created one of the world's first nation-states, with a centralized government, organized religion, and the beginnings of the bureaucracy that would characterize Egyptian civilization. The Old Kingdom, spanning roughly 2686 to 2181 BCE, represents ancient Egypt's first golden age. It was during this period that Egypt transformed from a unified kingdom into a sophisticated civilization, with remarkable achievements in architecture, art, and administration. This era, particularly the Fourth Dynasty, is known as the Pyramid Age. The Third Dynasty, Pharaoh Djoser, built the first pyramid, the Step Pyramid, at Saqqara, designed by his brilliant vizier and architect Imhotep. Standing 200 feet tall, this six-step structure revolutionized royal tomb architecture. But the true Pyramid Age reached its zenith under the Fourth Dynasty rulers Sneferu, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. Sneferu built multiple pyramids, refining the design with each attempt. His son Khufu constructed the Great Pyramid at Giza around 2560 BCE, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, and the only one still standing. The Great Pyramid is an engineering marvel. It originally stood 481 feet tall and consisted of approximately 2.3 million limestone blocks, each weighing between 2.5 and 15 tons. For over 3,800 years, it remained the tallest human-made structure on Earth. How did the ancient Egyptians build these monuments? Contrary to popular belief, recent evidence suggests the pyramids were not built by slaves, but by paid laborers, skilled workers, and seasonal agricultural workers who participated during the flood season when farming was impossible. They used copper tools, wooden sledges, and likely internal ramps to move and position the massive stones. The Old Kingdom established the template for Egyptian government. A god-king pharaoh supported by a complex bureaucracy of officials, scribes, and priests. Art and culture flourished, developing the distinctive Egyptian artistic style that would persist for millennia. Formal, stylized, and governed by strict conventions. Around 2181 BCE, the Old Kingdom collapsed. The reasons were complex. Environmental changes may have caused reduced Nile floods and famine. The power of provincial governors grew at the expense of the pharaoh, and the massive resources devoted to pyramid building may have exhausted the economy. Egypt fractured into competing kingdoms. This era, called the First Intermediate Period, lasted roughly 125 years and represented a dramatic break from the stability of the Old Kingdom. However, this wasn't necessarily a dark age. While centralized power had collapsed, provincial centers thrived. Art and literature flourished in different styles across regions. The period produced some of Egypt's most poignant literature, including texts that questioned traditional beliefs and reflected on human suffering and social upheaval. In Heracleopolis, a dynasty of rulers controlled the north, while in Thebes, a rival dynasty emerged in the south. These competing powers vied for control of Egypt until around 2055 BCE, when Mentuhotep II of Thebes finally reunified the country, ushering in the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom, from approximately 2055 to 1650 BCE, is often called the classical period of Egyptian civilization. This was an era of renaissance, cultural refinement, and territorial expansion. The pharaohs of the 11th and 12th dynasties restored, centralized, authority while learning from the Old Kingdom's mistakes. Rather than building massive pyramids that drained resources, they constructed smaller pyramids and focused on improving administration, expanding trade, and developing Egypt's infrastructure. The 12th dynasty represents the pinnacle of Middle Kingdom achievement. Pharaohs like Amenhotep I and Senuseret III were strong military leaders who campaigned in Nubia to the south, securing access to gold mines and establishing a series of massive fortresses along the Nile's second cataract. These fortresses were architectural marvels, massive mud brick structures with complex defensive systems. They controlled trade routes and protected Egypt's southern border, demonstrating sophisticated military engineering. The Middle Kingdom saw tremendous literary output. This was the golden age of Egyptian literature. Works like the story of Sinag, about an Egyptian official who flees to foreign lands, and the tale of the eloquent peasant, exploring themes of justice and rhetoric, were composed during this period. The language of the Middle Kingdom became the classical form of Egyptian, studied by scribes for centuries afterward. Art became more naturalistic, showing greater emotional depth. Statues of Middle Kingdom pharaohs often portray them with careworn faces, suggesting the burdens of leadership, a stark contrast to the serene, idealized faces of Old Kingdom sculpture. Religion evolved significantly. The god Amun rose to prominence, particularly after the capital moved to Thebes. Osiris, god of the underworld and resurrection, became increasingly important as beliefs about the afterlife democratized. No longer was eternal life the exclusive province of pharaohs. Ordinary Egyptians could aspire to life after death if they lived properly and were buried with appropriate rituals. The Middle Kingdom also saw increased contact with other cultures. Trade expeditions reached Punt on the Red Sea coast, bringing back incense, ebony, and exotic animals. Diplomatic relations were established with Levantine cities, and Egyptian influence spread throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Around 1650 BCE, Egypt entered another period of fragmentation, the Second Intermediate Period. This time, the disruption came not just from internal collapse, but from foreign invasion. A people the Egyptians called the Hyksos, meaning rulers of foreign lands, gradually infiltrated the Nile Delta from the Levant, taking advantage of Egypt's weakened central authority. The Hyksos established their own dynasty, the 15th dynasty, ruling from their capital at Avaris in the eastern delta. For generations, historians portrayed the Hyksos as barbaric invaders who conquered Egypt by force. Modern archaeology tells a more nuanced story. The Hyksos were likely Canaanites who migrated into Egypt gradually over many years, initially as traders and settlers. They eventually gained political control through a combination of military strength and political maneuvering rather than sudden conquest. The Hyksos brought new technologies and ideas to Egypt. They introduced the composite bow, new bronze working techniques, and most importantly, the horse and chariot military innovations that would transform ancient warfare. They also brought new musical instruments, new pottery styles, and new deities that were syncretized with Egyptian gods. While the Hyksos controlled the north, native Egyptian dynasties continued to rule in Thebes in the south. For over a century, Egypt remained divided, with Hyksos rulers in the delta, Egyptian rulers in Thebes, and Nubian kingdoms controlling the far south. The relationship between these powers was complex. Periods of conflict alternated with trade and diplomacy. But nationalist sentiment grew in Thebes, where rulers increasingly viewed themselves as the legitimate pharaohs of all Egypt, determined to expel the foreign Hyksos. Around 1550 BCE, the Theban ruler Ahmose I launched a campaign to drive out the Hyksos. After years of warfare, he succeeded in conquering Avaris and expelling the Hyksos from Egypt. Ahmose pursued them into southern Canaan, besieging the city of Sharuan for 3 years to ensure they could not return. Ahmose's victory reunified Egypt and established the 18th dynasty, marking the beginning of the New Kingdom Egypt's most powerful and prosperous era. The New Kingdom, from approximately 1550 to 1077 BCE, was Egypt's imperial age. Having learned from the Hyksos invasion that isolation was no longer sufficient protection, Egypt's pharaohs adopted an aggressive foreign policy, creating an empire that stretched from Nubia in the south to Syria in the north. The early 18th dynasty pharaohs were warrior kings. They adopted and improved upon Hyksos military technology, creating a professional army with chariot divisions, infantry units, and specialized troops. This army became the instrument of Egyptian expansion. Ahmose's successors pushed Egypt's borders in all directions. To the south, they reconquered Nubia, advancing far beyond the Second Cataract and establishing Egyptian control over Nubian gold mines and trade routes. To the northeast, they campaigned in the Levant and Syria, bringing city-states under Egyptian influence. This expansion created an empire that required administration. Egypt established a system of vassal states in Canaan and Syria, where local rulers governed their cities but owed allegiance and tribute to Pharaoh. Egyptian officials and garrisons monitored these territories, ensuring compliance. The wealth flowing into Egypt from tribute, trade, and mining was staggering. Gold from Nubia, cedar from Lebanon, horses from Mitanni, copper from Cyprus, and exotic goods from across the Near East filled Egyptian treasuries. This wealth funded massive building projects and elevated Egyptian culture to unprecedented heights. The capital remained at Thebes, which became a magnificent city. The Temple of Karnak, dedicated to Amun-Ra, began its transformation into the largest religious complex in the ancient world. Pharaohs added to this temple throughout the New Kingdom, each trying to outdo his predecessors. Royal burial practices changed significantly. Instead of pyramids, New Kingdom pharaohs were buried in rock-cut tombs in a remote valley across the Nile from Thebes, the Valley of the Kings. These hidden tombs, carved deep into the mountainside, were filled with treasures and sealed, in hope that they would escape the tomb robbers who had plundered the pyramids. Among Egypt's most remarkable rulers was Hatshepsut, who reigned from approximately 1479 to 1458 BC. She was one of the few women to rule Egypt as pharaoh, and her reign represents one of the most prosperous periods in Egyptian history. Hatshepsut was the daughter of Thutmose I and the principal wife of Thutmose II. When her husband died, his son by a minor wife, Thutmose III, was still a child. Hatshepsut became regent, ruling on behalf of her stepson. But within a few years, she took the unprecedented step of declaring herself pharaoh. To legitimize her rule, Hatshepsut employed sophisticated propaganda. She claimed that the god Amun was her true father, who had impregnated her mother in divine form. Temple reliefs show her birth as miraculous, divinely ordained. She wore traditional pharaonic regalia, including the false beard, and in statues and reliefs. She was often depicted with a male body. Despite the unusual circumstances of her rule, Hatshepsut's reign was remarkably successful. Rather than military conquest, she focused on trade, building projects, and internal development. Her greatest achievement was a trading expedition to Punt, a land somewhere on the Red Sea coast of Africa or Arabia. This expedition, recorded in detailed reliefs at her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, brought back enormous quantities of myrrh, frankincense, ebony, ivory, gold, and exotic animals. The reliefs show the ships being loaded, the strange houses of Punt built on stilts, and even the corpulent queen of Punta, rare humorous touch in Egyptian art. Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari is itself an architectural masterpiece. Built into the cliffs across from Thebes, it consists of 3 terrace levels connected by ramps, with colonnaded porticos adorned with painted reliefs. The temple harmonizes beautifully with its natural setting, representing a high point in Egyptian architecture. Hatshepsut also commissioned building projects throughout Egypt, restoring monuments damaged during the Hyksos period and adding to temples at Karnak and elsewhere. The economy flourished, and Egypt enjoyed relative peace. The mystery surrounding Hatshepsut deepens after her death. Her stepson, Thutmose III, eventually became sole ruler. Years later, someone, possibly Thutmose III, late in his reign, ordered Hatshepsut's images and names chiseled from monuments. This damnatio memoria attempted to erase her from history. Was it revenge, an attempt to restore proper succession order, or political necessity? We may never know for certain. Once free from Hatshepsut's regency, Thutmose III proved to be one of history's greatest military commanders, earning him the nickname the Napoleon of Egypt. He reigned for 54 years, but his major military campaigns occurred after Hatshepsut's death. Thutmose III conducted at least 17 military campaigns over 20 years, creating the largest empire Egypt would ever control. His greatest victory came at the Battle of Megiddo in 1457 BCE, one of the first battles recorded in detail in history. A coalition of Canaanite city-states, led by the ruler of Kadesh and backed by the kingdom of Mitanni, had rebelled against Egyptian authority. Thutmose marched his army north with unprecedented speed. When he reached Megiddo, his generals advised taking a longer, safer route to approach the rebel forces. Thutmose rejected their advice, boldly choosing a dangerous narrow pass that allowed him to surprise the enemy. The battle was a decisive Egyptian victory. The enemy forces retreated into Megiddo, and Thutmose besieged the city for 7 months until it surrendered. According to Egyptian records, the spoils were enormous: 924 chariots, 2,238 horses, 200 suits of armor, and a tent fit for a prince, among other treasures. Thutmose's campaigns pushed Egypt's borders to their greatest extent. In the north, Egyptian influence reached the Euphrates River, where Thutmose erected a victory stele. In the south, he campaigned deep into Nubia. Between these extremes, dozens of cities and states paid tribute to Egypt. But Thutmose was more than a warrior. He was an effective administrator who reorganized Egypt's empire into administrative districts, appointed officials to govern conquered territories, and established a system of hostages. Sons of foreign rulers were brought to Egypt, educated in Egyptian ways, then sent back to rule their cities as loyal vassals. He was also a great builder, adding to the Temple of Karnak with the Hall of Annals, where his military achievements were recorded in detail. These records are invaluable historical sources, providing precise information about his campaigns, including dates, routes, and spoils. In approximately 1353 BCE, Amenhotep IV ascended to the throne. Within a few years, he would launch one of ancient history's most radical religious revolutions, change his name to Akhenaten, and earn the title the Heretic Pharaoh. For nearly 2,000 years, Egypt had been polytheistic, worshipping hundreds of gods. The most powerful was Amun-Ra, king of the gods, whose priesthood at Karnak had accumulated enormous wealth and influence. Akhenaten challenged this entire system. Early in his reign, Akhenaten began promoting the Aten, the disk of the sun, as the supreme deity. Initially, this wasn't unusual. The Aten had been worshipped before, but Akhenaten took increasingly radical steps. He declared that Aten was not just the supreme god, but the only god. He was introducing monotheism, or at least something very close to it, to Egypt. In the 5th year of his reign, Akhenaten made his most dramatic move. He abandoned Thebes, the traditional capital and stronghold of Amun's priesthood, and built an entirely new capital city dedicated to the Aten. This city, Akhetaten Horizon of the Aten, was located at a site now called Amarna, halfway between Memphis and Thebes. Akhetaten was built rapidly on virgin desert. The city included palaces, temples, administrative buildings, workshops, and residential areas. Most remarkably, unlike traditional Egyptian temples, which were dark and mysterious, Aten temples were open to the sky, allowing sunlight, the physical manifestation of God, to flood the worship spaces. Akhenaten closed traditional temples, disbanded their priesthoods, and redirected their revenues to the Aten cult. He erased the names of other gods from monuments, particularly Ammon. The pharaoh declared himself the Aten's sole intermediary. All worship flowed through him. This religious revolution was accompanied by artistic revolution. The rigid conventions of Egyptian art were relaxed. Akhenaten commissioned art showing him in startlingly realistic, even unflattering ways. He was depicted with an elongated face, protruding belly, wide hips, and thin limbs. Whether this represented a medical condition or was simply a new artistic style is debated. But it was radically different from the idealized depictions of previous pharaohs. Art from this period also shows unprecedented intimacy. Reliefs depict Akhenaten with his wife Nefertiti and their daughters in domestic scenes, playing, kissing, dining, together, human moments rarely shown in Egyptian royal art. But while Akhenaten focused on religious matters, Egypt's empire began to crumble. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence found at Akhetaten, show desperate pleas from Egyptian vassals in Canaan and Syria, begging for military support against enemies. These pleas were largely ignored as Akhenaten concentrated on his religious revolution. Akhenaten ruled for about 17 years and died around 1336 BCE. His revolution died with him. His son, the boy who would become Tutankhamun, inherited a troubled kingdom. Under pressure from the old priesthood and military, the traditional religion was restored. Akhetaten was abandoned, and efforts began to erase Akhenaten from history. He became the heretic, his name chiseled from monuments, his city left to ruin. Tutankhamun ascended to the throne around 1332 BCE, at approximately 8 or 9 years old. He reigned for only about 10 years and achieved little of political or military significance. Yet today, he is the most famous pharaoh, known around the world simply as King Tut, born Tutankhamun, living image of the Aten. The boy king's early years were dominated by powerful advisors, particularly the Vizier I and the General Horemheb. These men guided the young pharaoh in reversing Akhenaten's religious revolution. Within a few years, the court returned to Thebes, abandoned Akhetaten, and restored the traditional gods. The young king changed his name to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, signaling the return to orthodoxy. Temples were reopened, priesthoods re-established, and Amun returned to his position as king of the gods. We know little about Tutankhamun's brief reign. He may have participated in military campaigns against Nubians and Asiatics, but the evidence is unclear. Analysis of his mummy shows he suffered from several ailments, including a cleft palate, a clubfoot, and bone disease. he likely walked with a cane. Dozens were found in his tomb. Tutankhamun died around 1323 BCE at approximately 18 or 19 years old. The cause of death has been endlessly debated. Was it murder, an accident, or complications from malaria? Recent studies suggest he may have died from a combination of a broken leg that became infected, complicated by malaria and his existing health problems. He was buried in a small tomb in the Valley of the Kings, probably not originally intended for a pharaoh. The burial was rushed, perhaps because his death was unexpected. And then, for over 3,300 years, his tomb lay forgotten, sealed under debris from the excavation of later tombs. In 1922, British archaeologist Howard Carter, funded by Lord Carnarvon, was conducting his last season of excavation in the Valley of the Kings. On November 4th, his workers uncovered a step cut into the bedrock. It led to a sealed doorway bearing Tutankhamun's cartouche. On November 26th, Carter made a small hole in the sealed doorway and peered inside with a candle. Lord Carnarvon asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter replied with words that would become legendary. "Yes, wonderful things." Tutankhamun's tomb contained over 5,000 objects, furniture, chariots, weapons, clothing, jewelry, musical instruments, games, and food for the afterlife. 3 coffins, one within another, protected the mummy. The innermost coffin, made of solid gold, weighing 110 kilograms. The pharaoh's head and shoulders were covered with the iconic golden death mask, now one of the world's most recognized artifacts. The discovery made Tutankhamun immortal in a way he never achieved in life, giving us our most complete picture of royal burial practices and treasures. If Tutankhamun is the most famous pharaoh today, Ramesses II was certainly the most famous in ancient times. Reigning for 66 years, from 1279 to 1213 BCE, Ramesses II would become the archetype of Egyptian pharaonic power. Ramesses II came to power in his early 20s and would outlive many of his wives and children, fathering over 100 children by various wives and concubines. His principal wife was Nefertari, whom he clearly loved. He built a temple for her at Abu Simbel, and her tomb in the Valley of the Queens is one of the most beautiful in Egypt. Early in his reign, Ramesses faced a major military crisis. The Hittite Empire, based in Anatolia, modern Turkey, was Egypt's rival for control of Syria. In 1274 BCE, these superpowers clashed at the Battle of Kadesh on the Orontes River. Ramesses, leading his army personally, marched into a Hittite trap. His forces were divided when the Hittites attacked. According to Egyptian accounts, Ramesses personally rallied his troops and fought heroically, turning near disaster into victory. Hittite accounts tell a different story of Egyptian retreat. The truth likely lies between. The battle was probably a tactical draw, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. What matters is that Ramesses exploited the battle for propaganda. Temple walls throughout Egypt are covered with scenes of Kadesh, showing Ramesses single-handedly defeating hordes of enemies. The battle became legendary, the pharaoh's finest hour. Eventually, Egypt and the Hittites made peace. Around 1259 BCE, they signed a treaty, one of the earliest peace treaties in history, and the oldest for which we have both sides' versions. The treaty established borders, mutual defense against enemies, and extradition of refugees. It was sealed by Ramesses marrying a Hittite princess, but Ramesses is best remembered as a builder. He launched the most ambitious building program in Egyptian history, covering Egypt with temples, statues, and monuments. He added to existing temples and built new ones from scratch. Many bear his name and image repeatedly, sometimes carved over the names of earlier pharaohs, appropriating their monuments as his own. His greatest monument is Abu Simbel in Nubia. Cut into a sandstone cliff, the temple features four colossal seated statues of Ramesses, each 65 feet high, flanking the entrance. Inside, the temple extends over 180 feet into the rock, with halls supported by more statues of the deified pharaoh. The temple was precisely aligned so that twice a year, on February 22nd and October 22nd, supposedly Ramesses' birthday and coronation, day sunlight penetrates the entire length of the temple to illuminate statues of the gods in the inner sanctuary. Next to this temple, Ramesses built a smaller temple for Nefertari with 6 statues on its facade, 4 of Ramesses and 2 of Nefertari, equal in size. This was extraordinary. Queens were usually shown much smaller than the pharaoh. Ramesses also built a new capital city, Pi-Ramesses, in the eastern delta near his family's hometown. This city served as his base for campaigns in Asia and eventually became one of ancient Egypt's largest cities. The Ramesseum, his mortuary temple on the west bank at Thebes, was another massive structure. A fallen statue of Ramesses there, weighing over 1,000 tons, inspired Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem Ozymandias about the impermanence of power and glory. Ramesses II died in his early 90s, having outlived many of his heirs. His 13th son, Merenta, succeeded him. Ramesses was buried in a magnificent tomb in the Valley of the Kings. His mummy, discovered in 1881, shows an elderly man with white hair, a hooked nose, and a strong jaw, still recognizably the face shown in his youthful statues. The decades following Ramesses II's death saw Egypt face new threats. The late Bronze Age Mediterranean world was entering a period of crisis. Around 1200 BCE, a catastrophe struck the eastern Mediterranean as systems collapsed that destroyed empires and civilizations. The Hittite Empire fell. Mycenaean Greece collapsed. Cities across the Levant were destroyed. Ugarit, a wealthy trading city, was burned and never rebuilt. Even powerful empires like Assyria barely survived. The causes were complex: drought, famine, economic disruption, and migrations of peoples. Egypt faced this crisis in the form of the Sea Peoples, a confederation of groups from the Aegean, Anatolia, and the Levant, moving east and south, destroying everything in their path. We don't know exactly who they were. The Egyptians listed names like Peleset, Jekka, Shekelesh, and Denayan, but matching these two known peoples is difficult. The Peleset may have been the Philistines who would settle in Canaan. Merenta, Ramesses II's son, faced the first attacks. In the 5th year of his reign, Libyan tribes allied with Sea Peoples invaded the western delta. Merenta defeated them in a 6-hour battle, claiming to have killed over 6,000 enemies. The greatest threat came during the reign of Ramesses III, 1186 to 1155 BCE, the last great warrior pharaoh of the New Kingdom. In his 8th year, a massive confederation of Sea Peoples attacked Egypt by land and sea simultaneously. This was an existential threat. They came not just as raiders, but as migrants with families, seeking new lands. Ramesses III prepared carefully. He fortified the delta, stationed troops along the coast, and prepared a fleet of warships. When the Sea Peoples arrived, Egyptian forces met them on land and sea. The naval battle, depicted in detail in Ramesses' mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, shows Egyptian ships engaging enemy vessels, archers firing from the decks, soldiers fighting hand-to-hand. The Egyptians won decisively, turning back the invasion. Ramesses III claimed total victory and presented himself as Egypt's savior. But the victory came at enormous cost. The wars drained the treasury. The disruption of trade routes damaged the economy. The Bronze Age world that had sustained Egypt for centuries was gone. Egypt's troubles multiplied. Ramesses III faced internal problems: corruption, strikes by unpaid workers, and at least one assassination plot involving royal wives and officials. The conspiracy was discovered and the plotters executed, but it showed the weakening of pharaonic authority. After Ramesses III, a series of weaker rulers, all named Ramesses, struggled to maintain control. The empire in Asia was lost as Egypt withdrew from Canaan and Syria. Nubia began to break away. The priesthood of Amun at Thebes accumulated enormous power and wealth, rivaling the pharaohs themselves. By 1077 BCE, Egypt was effectively divided again. The high priest of Amun controlled Upper Egypt from Thebes, while pharaohs ruled Lower Egypt from the delta. The new kingdom was over. The third intermediate period, from about 1077 to 664 BCE, was a time of division, foreign influence, and decline. Egypt fragmented into competing power centers, and for the first time, foreign dynasties ruled parts of Egypt. The period began with Egypt split between Tanis in the north, where the 21st dynasty ruled, and Thebes in the south, controlled by high priests of Amun, who were virtually independent kings. These two powers maintained diplomatic relations. Royal marriages united the families, but Egypt lacked unified leadership. Meanwhile, Libya had been sending migrants into Egypt for centuries. Libyan soldiers served in Egypt's army, and Libyan families settled in the delta. Eventually, these Libyans gained power. Shoshenq I, a Libyan general, founded the 22nd dynasty around 945 BCE, briefly reunifying Egypt. Shoshenq I is known to biblical scholars as Shishak, the pharaoh who, according to the Bible, attacked Jerusalem during the reign of Rehoboam and plundered Solomon's temple. Egyptian records confirm that Shoshenq campaigned in Palestine, and an inscription at Karnak lists over 150 cities he claimed to have conquered or subdued. But this unity was temporary. Within generations, multiple rulers simultaneously claimed the title of pharaoh. At one point, several different dynasties ruled different parts of Egypt concurrently. The 22nd, 23rd, and 24th dynasties overlapped chronologically. During this fragmentation, another power emerged from the south. In Nubia, in the region called Kush, a kingdom had developed that maintained Egyptian culture and religion even as Egypt itself fractured. The Kushites saw themselves as guardians of true Egyptian traditions. Around 747 BCE, the Kushite king Pi marched north, claiming he was restoring order and proper worship of Amun. He conquered city after city, eventually subduing all of Egypt. Pi's victory steely describes his campaign in detail, showing his contempt for the divided Egyptian rulers and his piety toward the gods. Pi returned to Nubia, but his successors, particularly Shabaka and Taharqa, ruled Egypt as the 25th dynasty, the Nubian dynasty or Black Pharaohs. These African rulers ironically became some of the most traditional pharaohs, restoring old temples, reviving ancient artistic styles, and positioning themselves as legitimate heirs to Egypt's glorious past. Taharqa, the most famous of the Nubian pharaohs, ruled from 690 to 664 BC. He built ostensibly, erecting monuments from Nubia to the delta. He's mentioned in the Bible as coming to the aid of King Hezekiah of Judah against the Assyrian invasion. But, Taharka's reign coincided with the rise of a new Near Eastern superpower, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians, under kings like Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, were building an empire that would encompass Mesopotamia, the Levant, and eventually Egypt itself. The Assyrians invaded Egypt multiple times. They captured Memphis, drove Taharka back to Nubia, and sacked Thebes in 664 BCE, an event so shocking it's mentioned in the Bible. The great city that had been Egypt's capital for centuries was plundered, its treasures carried off to Assyria. After the Assyrian conquest, Egypt entered what historians call the Late Period. But this era began not with darkness, but with a surprising renaissance under the 26th dynasty, also called the Site dynasty after its capital at Sais in the Delta, the Site pharaohs. Beginning with Psamtik I in 664 BCE, had initially been Assyrian vassals. But as Assyria became overextended and faced challenges from the Babylonians and Medes, Egypt gradually regained independence. By 656 BCE, Psamtik controlled all of Egypt. The Site dynasty, ruling from 664 to 525 BCE, brought stability and prosperity. These pharaohs looked backward, consciously imitating Old and Middle Kingdom art, architecture, and literature. This wasn't mere nostalgia, but a deliberate cultural program to reconnect with Egypt's glorious past and legitimize their rule. Saite art is remarkable for its technical perfection. Sculptors created works of extraordinary refinement, often studying and copying Old Kingdom masterpieces. The result was beautiful, but sometimes feels lifeless compared to earlier periods, technically perfect, but lacking spontaneity. The Saite pharaohs encouraged foreign trade and settlement. Greek merchants established trading posts in Egypt, particularly at Naucratis in the Delta. Greek mercenaries served in Egyptian armies. This Greek presence would have profound consequences, introducing Egypt to the broader Mediterranean world and vice versa. Psamtik II and his son Oprais led military campaigns, but the dynasty's greatest pharaoh was probably Amasis, 570 to 526 BCE. Originally a general who seized power, Amasis proved a capable administrator and diplomat. He cultivated good relations with Greece, maintaining the trading post at Naucratis and dedicating gifts to Greek temples. He allied with Cyrene and married a Greek woman. But storm clouds gathered. To the east, a new power was rising: Persia. Under Cyrus the Great, the Persian Empire had conquered Media, Lydia, and Babylon, creating the largest empire the world had yet seen. Egypt, wealthy and isolated no more, would inevitably attract Persian attention. In 526 BCE, Amasis died, and his son Psamtik III inherited the throne. Within months, the Persian king Cambyses II invaded Egypt. At the Battle of Pelusium in 525 BCE, the Persian army defeated the Egyptians decisively. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, Cambyses used psychological warfare, placing cats and other animals sacred to Egyptians at the front of his army, knowing the Egyptians would hesitate to harm them. Whether true or legend, Persia conquered Egypt and made it a province or satrapy of the Persian Empire. The 27th dynasty was actually Persian kings, ruling as pharaohs of Egypt. Cambyses visited major temples and initially tried to respect Egyptian customs. But later, Greek and Egyptian sources portray him as a sacrilegious tyrant who desecrated temples and killed the sacred Apis bull. His successor, Darius I, was more conciliatory. He completed a canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea, enabling ships to sail from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. He codified Egyptian laws and posed as a traditional pharaoh, having himself depicted in Egyptian style on temple walls. Still, Egypt resented foreign rule. Several revolts erupted, particularly when Persia faced difficulties elsewhere. In 404 BCE, following Persian defeats in Greece, Egypt successfully rebelled. For about 60 years, native Egyptian dynasties, the 28th, 29th, and 30th, ruled independently. The last native Egyptian pharaoh was Nectanebo II of the 30th dynasty. He ruled from 360 to 343 BCE and was a great builder, adding 2 temples throughout Egypt. But in 343 BCE, the Persian king Artaxerxes III reconquered Egypt, ending native rule forever. This second Persian occupation was harsh. Persian officials looted temples and suppressed Egyptian culture. Egypt seethed with resentment, waiting for liberation. Liberation came from an unexpected source, a young Macedonian king named Alexander. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great marched into Egypt during his campaign against Persia. The Egyptians, hating their Persian overlords, welcomed him as a liberator. Alexander visited Memphis, where he was crowned pharaoh with traditional ceremonies. He then traveled to the Oracle of Ammon at Siwa Oasis in the western desert. What happened there remains mysterious. But Alexander emerged, claiming the oracle had confirmed he was the son of Zeusamon, a god incarnate. Before leaving Egypt to continue his conquests, Alexander founded a city on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria. This city, designed by the architect Dinocrates on a grid pattern, would become one of the ancient world's greatest metropolises, a center of learning, culture, and commerce. Alexander never returned to Egypt. He died in Babylon in 323 BCE at age 32, having conquered an empire stretching from Greece to India. His generals fought over this empire, and Egypt fell to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's closest companions. Ptolemy founded a dynasty that would rule Egypt for 3 centuries, the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemies were Greek, not Egyptian. They spoke Greek, maintained Greek culture, and ruled from the thoroughly Greek city of Alexandria. Yet they adopted the title and trappings of pharaoh, portrayed themselves in Egyptian style on temple walls, and patronized Egyptian religion. The Ptolemies made Alexandria the cultural capital of the Hellenistic world. They built the Great Library of Alexandria, which aimed to collect all the world's knowledge. At its height, the library may have contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls. They also built the pharaohs, a massive lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, standing over 350 feet tall and guiding ships into Alexandria's harbor. Under the Ptolemies, Greek and Egyptian cultures coexisted. Alexandria was a Greek city with Greek institutions, but temples throughout Egypt continued Egyptian traditions. The famous Rosetta Stone, carved during the reign of Ptolemy V in 196 BCE, illustrates this duality, contains the same text in Greek, Demotic, Egyptian, and hieroglyphics. The early Ptolemies were capable rulers. Ptolemy to Philadelphia's expanded trade, sending expeditions down the Red Sea to India and Africa. The kingdom prospered from Egypt's agricultural wealth, controlled trade routes, and exports of grain, papyrus, and manufactured goods. But the later Ptolemies declined into decadence and dynastic intrigue. Brothers married sisters, family members murdered each other for power, and civil wars erupted repeatedly. Egypt became increasingly dependent on Rome, the rising power in the Mediterranean. The last and most famous Ptolemaic ruler was Cleopatra VII, who became queen in 51 BCE. Cleopatra was the first Ptolemaic ruler to actually learn. Egyptian previous ones had ruled for 3 centuries without speaking their subjects' language. She was highly educated, speaking multiple languages, and politically astute. Cleopatra's reign coincided with Rome's transformation from republic to empire. She famously allied herself with Julius Caesar, bearing him a son, Caesarion. After Caesar's assassination, she allied with Mark Antony, bearing him 3 children. These relationships were political as much as romantic. Cleopatra was fighting to preserve Egypt's independence against Roman domination. But Cleopatra and Antony lost the decisive Battle of Actium in 31 BCE to Octavian, later Caesar Augustus. As Octavian's forces approached Alexandria, both Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide. Egypt became a Roman province in 30 BC. After 3,000 years, native Egyptian civilization effectively ended. Egypt would remain a Roman, then Byzantine, then Arab province for centuries. The ancient language, religion, and culture gradually faded. By the 4th century CE, with Christianity spreading, the old gods were abandoned. The last hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 CE. The ability to read hieroglyphics was lost, and ancient Egypt became a mystery. Under Roman rule, Egypt was the emperor's personal property, so valuable that no senator could visit without imperial permission. Egypt's grain fed Rome. 1/3 of Rome's grain supply came from Egyptian harvests. Alexandria remained a great city, second only to Rome itself. The Romans maintained some Egyptian traditions. They depicted emperors as pharaohs on temple walls and supported some Egyptian cults. But Egypt was just one province in a vast empire, and Roman culture increasingly dominated. Christianity spread through Egypt early. According to tradition, Saint Mark brought Christianity to Alexandria in the 1st century CE. By the 4th century, most Egyptians were Christian. The Coptic Church, as Egyptian Christianity became known, developed its own distinct character, and Coptic, the final evolution of the ancient Egyptian language, written with Greek letters, became the liturgical language. Christian monks established monasteries in the Egyptian desert, pioneering Christian monasticism. Ironically, they sometimes occupied ancient Egyptian temples, which they defaced, chiseling out pagan images and covering walls with crosses. In 641 CE, Arab Muslim armies conquered Egypt, ending Byzantine rule. Egypt gradually became Arabic-speaking and predominantly Muslim, though a significant Christian minority persists today. Cairo, founded in 969 CE, became the capital, replacing Alexandria. Ancient Egypt was not forgotten. The pyramids and temples remained visible, but knowledge of the civilization was lost. Arab scholars admired the monuments but couldn't read hieroglyphics. Europeans knew Egypt from the Bible and classical authors, but had no direct access to Egyptian sources. Egypt's rediscovery began with Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798. Napoleon brought not just soldiers, but 167 scholar-scientists, engineers, artists, and scholars to study Egypt systematically. They measured pyramids, copied hieroglyphic inscriptions, and documented monuments. Though Napoleon's military campaign failed, the British destroyed the French fleet and eventually forced French withdrawal. Scholarly work produced the massive Description de l'Egypte, published in multiple volumes from 1809 to 1829. This work introduced Europe to ancient Egypt in unprecedented detail, sparking Egyptomania that persists today. The French expedition's most important discovery came in 1799 when French soldiers near Rosetta found a stone with inscriptions in 3 scripts: hieroglyphics, Demotic, Egyptian, and Greek. This Rosetta Stone would prove the key to deciphering hieroglyphics. The race to decode hieroglyphics captured Europe's imagination. Many scholars worked on the problem, but 2 names dominate: Thomas Young, an English polymath, and Jean-François Champollion, a French linguistic prodigy. Young made important breakthroughs, particularly recognizing that cartouches Sauval frames in inscriptions enclosed royal names, and that some hieroglyphs represented sounds rather than just concepts. But Champollion made the decisive breakthrough. In September 1822, Champollion succeeded in deciphering the script. He realized that hieroglyphics combined ideographic symbols representing concepts with phonetic symbols representing sounds. Using the Rosetta Stone's Greek text as a guide and applying his knowledge of Coptic, which preserved elements of ancient Egyptian, he unlocked the script. Legend says that upon making his breakthrough, Champollion rushed to his brother's office, shouted "G10's l'affaire, I've got it," and promptly fainted. True or not, the achievement was monumental. After 1,400 years of silence, ancient Egypt could speak again. With hieroglyphics decoded, Egyptology was born as a scientific discipline. Scholars could read temple inscriptions, medical texts, mathematical papyri, literature, and historical records. Ancient Egypt emerged from myth into history. The 19th century saw intensive exploration and excavation in Egypt. Though early methods would horrify modern archaeologists, Giovanni Belzoni, a former circus strongman, used battering rams to enter tombs and extracted massive statues and artifacts for European collectors. Countless treasures left Egypt for museums in London, Paris, Berlin, and Turin. Gradually, methods improved. Auguste Mariette, a French scholar, became director of Egyptian antiquities in 1858 and worked to preserve monuments and control excavation. He founded the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, keeping artifacts in Egypt rather than seeing them exported. British archaeologist Flinders Petrie revolutionized Egyptian archaeology in the 1880s. He pioneered systematic excavation, careful recording, and attention to seemingly mundane objects, pottery, tools, everyday items that revealed how people actually lived. His methods established standards still followed today. Major discoveries punctuated the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In 1881, a remarkable cache was found near Deir el-Bahariya tomb containing dozens of royal mummies, including Ramesses II and Thutmose III. These mummies had been gathered by ancient priests and hidden to protect them from tomb robbers. Today, they rest in Cairo's Egyptian Museum, faces we can look upon thousands of years after death. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, which we discussed earlier, remains the most famous archaeological find in history. Howard Carter's decade-long excavation and documentation of the tomb set new standards for archaeological practice. Excavations continue today using technologies unimaginable to early archaeologists. Ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, DNA analysis, CT scans, and chemical analysis provide insights our predecessors couldn't dream of. In 2017, cosmic Raymond imaging revealed a large void inside the Great Pyramid, possibly an unknown chamber. Excavations in workers' villages, cemeteries, and provincial sites revealed details of ordinary Egyptians' lives. Underwater archaeology explores ancient ports and cities now submerged beneath the Mediterranean. Heraklion, a major port city lost for centuries, has been located and explored, yielding statues, inscriptions, and ships that illuminate Egypt's maritime trade. Modern Egyptology. Modern Egyptology has transformed our understanding of ancient Egypt. We now know this wasn't a static, unchanging civilization, but a dynamic society that evolved over 3 millennia. Egyptian religion was extraordinarily complex. They worshipped hundreds of deities, many with overlapping roles and attributes. Gods could merge. Amen combined with Ra to become Amun-Ra. Deities had local and national aspects. The same god might be depicted differently in different regions or eras. Creation myths varied by region. In Heliopolis, the sun god Atum created himself from primordial chaos and generated other gods. In Memphis, the god Ptah created the universe through thought and speech. In Hermopolis, 8 primordial deities existed before creation. These weren't contradictions to Egyptians, but different facets of divine truth. The concept of Mat was central. Mat was both a goddess and a principle. Pharaohs ruled to maintain Mat, priests performed rituals to sustain Mat, and individuals lived righteously to align with Mat. Chaos, disorder, and injustice were Isfit, Mat's opposite. They were always threatening to overwhelm the ordered world. Egyptians believed in an afterlife, but not a simple heaven or hell. The deceased faced judgment in the Hall of Two Truths, where the heart was weighed against Mat's feather. The god Anubis conducted the weighing, while Thoth recorded results. If the heart balanced with the feather, the deceased entered the field of reeds. This was an idealized version of Egypt, where they'd live eternally. If the heart was heavy with sin, the monster Amit devoured it, ending existence. To reach the afterlife, complex preparations were necessary. The body had to be preserved through mummification. This was a process involving removing organs, desiccating the body with natron salt, and wrapping it in linen. This took about 70 days and could be expensive. Only the wealthy could afford elaborate mummification. Tombs were filled with provisions for the afterlife. These included food, clothing, furniture, tools, weapons, and Ushabti figures. These were small statues that would magically come to life to perform labor for the deceased. Tomb walls bore spells from the Book of the Dead. This was a collection of magical texts to help the deceased navigate the afterlife's dangers. Egyptian society was hierarchical but not closed. At the top was the pharaoh, a living god, mediator between human and divine realms. Below came the nobility, priests, and officials. Scribes occupied a prestigious position because literacy was rare and valuable. Below them came artisans, soldiers, farmers, and laborers. Slavery existed, but was less central than in many ancient societies. Women in Egypt had more rights than in many ancient cultures. They could own property, initiate divorce, conduct business, and inherit wealth. Some women reached positions of power, not just Cleopatra and Hatshepsut, but queens like Tai and Nefertari, who exercised significant influence. However, society remained patriarchal. Most positions of power were held by men. Egyptian art followed strict conventions for nearly 3,000 years. Human figures were shown with head and legs in profile but torso facing forward. This wasn't because Egyptians couldn't draw realistically, but because this conveyed maximum information. Size indicated importance. Pharaohs were shown larger than other people. Art served religious and political purposes, designed for eternity rather than aesthetic appreciation. Yet within these conventions, remarkable individuality emerged. The Amarna period relaxed rules. and even traditional art shows variation in quality and expression. The best Egyptian sculpture displays remarkable sensitivity and realism. Examples include the bust of Nefertiti or seated scribes of the Old Kingdom. Ancient Egypt's influence on subsequent civilizations was profound. The Greeks admired Egypt as the source of ancient wisdom. Many Greek thinkers, including Pythagoras and Plato, supposedly studied in Egypt. Herodotus devoted much of his histories to describing Egypt, providing invaluable information despite occasional errors and credulity. The Greeks and Romans borrowed Egyptian religious concepts. The cult of Isis spread throughout the Roman Empire, reaching as far as Britain. The idea of divine kingship influenced Hellenistic and Roman rulers. Egyptian medicine, mathematics, and astronomy influenced Greek science. Through Rome, Egyptian influences reached medieval Europe. The concept of the obelisk was a four-sided tapering monument copied by Romans. They transported original Egyptian obelisks to Rome. Today, more ancient Egyptian obelisks stand in Rome than in Egypt. Later, civilizations continued erecting obelisks in homage to ancient Egypt. Egyptian motifs entered Western art and architecture, particularly after Napoleon's expedition. The 19th century saw Egyptian revival architecture incorporating pyramids, columns, and hieroglyphic-style decorations. The Washington Monument is essentially an obelisk. Art Deco absorbed Egyptian influences after Tutankhamun's discovery in the 1920s. Ancient Egypt gave us the 365-day calendar, divided into 12 months. While we've reformed it since, the basic structure comes from Egypt. Egyptian medicine, though mixed with magic, included sophisticated surgical procedures, anatomical knowledge, and treatments still recognizable today. Egyptian literature influenced the Bible. The hymn to the Aten, composed during Akhenaten's reign, shows remarkable similarity to Psalm 104. The story of Moses bears resemblances to Egyptian texts. The Book of Proverbs shares themes with Egyptian wisdom literature. Most fundamentally, Egypt demonstrated that complex civilization could endure for millennia. Egyptian civilization lasted longer than any other. From unification around 3100 BCE to Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE spans over 3,000 years. Rome, by comparison, lasted about 1,000 years. This longevity inspires both admiration and reflection on what enables civilizations to endure. Despite nearly 2 centuries of Egyptology, ancient Egypt retains mysteries. How exactly were the pyramids built? We understand the basic principles, but specific techniques remain debated. Recent discoveries of workers, villagers, and ramp remnants provide clues, but much remains uncertain. The purpose of the pyramids is clear as royal tombs, but some details puzzle us. The king's chamber in the Great Pyramid contains shafts pointing to specific stars. Were these symbolic pathways for the pharaoh's soul? The pyramid's orientation, alignment, and mathematical properties have spawned countless theories. Some are scholarly, others wildly speculative. Sphinx controversies persist. The Great Sphinx at Giza, with a human head and lion's body, sits near the pyramids. Most scholars date it to Khafu's reign around 2500 BCE, but some geologists argue weathering patterns suggest greater age. This remains highly contested. Cleopatra's tomb has never been found. Did it survive, or was it destroyed? Archaeologists continue searching, recently exploring sites near Alexandria. Discovery would be sensational, but may never occur. Many royal mummies have been identified, but some remained mysterious. A female mummy from the Valley of the Kings, KV-21, might be Ankhesenamun, Tutankhamun's wife, but identification remains uncertain. DNA analysis of royal mummies has revealed family relationships, but it also raises questions about health, inbreeding, and succession. Ancient Egypt attracts pseudo-scientific claims. Some say that aliens built the pyramids, or that ancient Egyptians had advanced technology. Others claim that the pyramids were power plants or astronomical observatories rather than tombs. Serious Egyptologists reject these theories. The evidence for conventional explanations is overwhelming. These alternative theories typically ignore vast amounts of evidence while cherry-picking details. Yet mysteries remain within legitimate scholarship. How did Egyptian knowledge develop? Why did certain practices change while others remained constant? What did ordinary Egyptians believe versus official religion? How accurate are our translations of complex religious texts? These questions drive ongoing research. What can we learn from ancient Egypt's 3,000-year history? Several lessons emerge. First, environmental stability enables civilization. The Nile's predictable floods provided the foundation for Egyptian society. When climate changed, Egypt experienced crisis. The first intermediate period likely resulted partly from reduced floods. Today, as we face climate change, this reminder is sobering. Second, continuity and change can coexist. Egyptian civilization maintained core identity for millennia, yet adapted constantly to new challenges. The Egypt of the Old Kingdom differed significantly from New Kingdom Egypt, which differed from Ptolemaic Egypt. Yet all were recognizably Egyptian. Third, cultural memory matters. Egyptians constantly looked backward, drawing legitimacy from the past. Saysite dynasty pharaohs imitated Old Kingdom art. Throughout Egyptian history, scribes copied ancient texts, preserving knowledge across centuries. This reverence for tradition helped maintain continuity but sometimes hindered innovation. Fourth, even great civilizations decline. Egypt survived invasions, droughts, and internal collapse multiple times, yet ultimately fell to foreign rule. The late period saw Egypt struggle to maintain independence despite military efforts and diplomatic maneuvering. No civilization lasts forever, but some leave legacies that outlive their political existence. Fifth, literacy and record-keeping preserve history. We know ancient Egypt intimately because Egyptians wrote extensively. They wrote on papyrus, stone, pottery, and walls. They recorded history, religious beliefs, scientific knowledge, poetry, and daily transactions. Without this written legacy, Egypt would be as mysterious as prehistoric cultures. Finally, death and eternity shaped Egyptian civilization profoundly. No culture has ever been more concerned with preserving the dead and ensuring eternal life. This obsession produced the pyramids, elaborate tombs, mummification, and endless funerary texts. Yet this focus on death paradoxically celebrated life. Tomb paintings show feasting, dancing, hunting, and joy. Egyptians prepared so elaborately for the afterlife because they loved life and wanted it to continue forever. Ancient Egypt ended over 2,000 years ago, yet it lives on in our imagination. The pyramids still stand, defying time. Museum galleries display treasures that awed ancient peoples and still impress modern visitors. Hieroglyphics, once mysterious symbols, now tell stories of kings and commoners, gods and mortals, triumphs and tragedies. We stand at a unique moment in history. More is known about ancient Egypt than ever before, yet much remains to discover. New technologies reveal secrets. DNA analysis tells us about family relationships and diseases. Chemical analysis reveals what people ate and drank. Satellite imagery locates buried structures. Each year brings new discoveries. The story of Egypt is not just ancient history, but part of our shared human heritage. It reminds us of human capacity for achievement. This includes building monuments that last millennia, creating art of timeless beauty, developing complex thought systems, and organizing society on a grand scale. But it also reminds us of human limitations. Despite their power, pharaohs died. Despite their strength, empires fell. Despite careful preservation, tombs were robbed and monuments crumbled. The mightiest civilization of the ancient world exists now only in ruins and memories. Yet those ruins and memories endure. 3,000 years after the last pyramid was built, people still marvel at them. 2,000 years after hieroglyphics ceased being written, we can read them. Over to millennia after Cleopatra's death ended native Egyptian civilization, we remember her name and tell her story. In this sense, the ancient Egyptians achieved their goal. They sought eternal life, and in a way, they found it. Not in the afterlife they imagined, but in human memory and imagination. As long as people study Egypt, visit its monuments, and tell its stories, ancient Egypt lives on. The Nile still flows north through Egypt, as it has for millions of years. It still brings life to the desert. The pyramids still rise from the plateau at Giza, silhouetted against the sky. The sun still rises over the Valley of the Kings, illuminating tombs carved 3,000 years ago. Egypt's gift to humanity was not just the civilization itself, but the lesson that human achievement can transcend time. Knowledge can be preserved across millennia, and even when civilizations fall, their contributions to human culture endure. This has been the story of ancient Egypt. A civilization that emerged from the Nile, flourished for 3,000 years, and left a legacy that still shapes our world today. From the step pyramid of Djoser to Cleopatra's Alexandria, from hieroglyphics on temple walls to treasures in Tutankhamun's tomb, ancient Egypt continues to fascinate, inspire, and remind us of the heights human civilization can reach.